Welcome Formula One fans, this is the Formula One News Hour. I'm your host, Jonathan Steele. We missed last week. As you may recall, I have been suffering from shingles and decided last week to take a week off and fully recover. Of course, you don't fully recover from shingles in 1 week. It takes a while, and I'm happy to say that other than being fatigued, I have at least got past the painful stage of shingles and I'm on the road to recovery. Let's start by thanking our sponsors for the Formula One News Hour. We have Phenology, Off the Press, Moms for Liberty, Give Send Go, El American, and Inform America. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors for sticking with us here through the off season. We are in the throes of contacting folks that we met at the US Grand Prix here in Austin about doing interviews, and so we hope to have those for you in the coming weeks. We will of course have other Formula One news and information, and in this week after the history section I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences that I've seen in the Formula One in the nearly probably 60 years that I've been following it. So just a little bit of newsy things. The head of Ferrari, the team principal of Ferrari, can't pronounce his name, very sorry about that, but he has exited, he has resigned, and he is no longer with Ferrari, which is a shame. He started working for Ferrari right out of college. After he's an engineer, and right after getting out of engineering college or university, he went to work for Ferrari and worked his way up from an engineer all the way to team principal. So we wish him, of course, all the best in his newfound endeavors. I doubt whether he will be out of Formula One very long. You know, yeah, they had a rough year this year, and not really a rough year. The first probably, four or 5 months was rough. They had a lot of missteps along the way, and of course, as in any business, the guy at the top always takes the fall because he's ultimately responsible. He's ultimately responsible in this case for approving the guys that make the decisions along the way. So what Ferrari are talking about is kind of mirroring Red Bull's setup, their hierarchical structure, to where you have the chairman and then the team principal and then the team engineer. So we'll see how that goes. The other interesting news is that Hannah Schultz has been named Engineer of the Year in the Formula One world. No surprise there. That lady did an outstanding job of guiding the Red Bull team through each of the races. As you may remember, she is the strategist for Red Bull, and all congratulations to her. She did a really, really good job. So our history this year is on a guy called Phil Hill. Phil is a forgotten Formula One champion. A very interesting guy though. He is the only American-born Formula One champion in history. Mario Andretti, who is an American now, of course won the championship in 1978, but Mario Andretti was born in Serbia. Phil Hill was born in Miami in 1927, and one of the few guys from the 60s that got out alive and made it all the way through and ended up dying where he pretty much grew up in Southern California in 1985. But some very interesting things about Phil Hill. One is that after all of these years of Formula One, he is the only American-born Formula One champion. He was Formula One world champion in 1961. So he didn't really start out with great aspirations, I don't think, of being a Formula One driver. He went to the University of Southern California and he was studying business administration there. and then he left and started working as a mechanic on some of his friends and others' cars. So he was, kind of around the racing circuit in the late 40s and early 50s as a mechanic. In fact, he went to England to study, I guess, being a mechanic or being an engineer or being whatever. He went and studied and worked for Jaguar. And that lasted a couple of years, and along the way he continued to work as a mechanic for different teams, and then got himself involved as many of these guys did. If you remember, in those early days, a lot of the guys would get themselves into the racing world by being a mechanic, by being a rally driver, by being everything completely different to what they are today. If you don't start off in the Formula One world today in kart racing, you are never going to get to be a Formula One driver. Even the IndyCar drivers and all these guys, they're all starting their careers off in karting. And most, if you look around the world, most of the Formula One tracks have kart tracks on the outside. The one here in Austin, the Circuit of the Americas, has a kart track, and you'll find all the karting enthusiasts and wannabe Formula One drivers, or maybe IndyCar drivers of the future, you'll find them down there at Circuit of the Americas. So Phil Hill started, his first Formula One race was in 1956. He had been signed by Ferrari, but he, in actual fact, his very first race was driving a Maserati. And he did quite well in that race, and subsequent races that he did drive in the early days, he had troubles qualifying for. But a lot of times, especially back then, if you remember the cars, which back then, by the way, were still front-engined back in the late 40s and the early 50s, all the way through probably until late 50s. In fact, I think the last Formula One car that was a front-engine car was around 1958. So the cars back then, of course, handled very differently, drove very differently, and Phil Hill managed to get his way into driving Formula One. Formula One would not be the first race that he would win. In fact, the very first race that he would win would be the 1958 Le Mans 24-hour race, driving with a co-driver who was an Italian guy. And Phil, it's strange because he grew up in California where there's not a lot of rain, but he ended up getting the stint of driving through the night, and it apparently was heavy rain for most of that race and during the night. And so he went on to win that race. That was his first go at a Le Mans 24-hour race, and he would win it. He would go on and win 2 more Le Mans 24-hour races and 3 Sebring 12-hour races. So I think he was quite adept at driving the more sports car type cars than he was Formula One. He did drive for Ferrari for a total of 3 to 4 years, and as I say, winning the World Championship in 1961. After that, he drove for a team that was a spin-off of some Ferrari engineers, and I think ATX or ATH was the name of that company, and it wasn't that successful, but I guess he had a lot of fun for it. And then, of course, he went on to drive for the Cooper team. If you remember, a lot of the guys in the 60s drove for Cooper, and he is the same guy that the Mini Cooper is named after. He built a lot of Mini Cooper rally cars, and of course the production car as well. So Mr. Cooper, a very accomplished driver, but a more accomplished designer and engineer as the years went on. So Phil's career went on quite nicely until probably the middle to late 60s. In fact, I think his last race was in 1967. So here's a very interesting thing about Phil Hill. He is the only driver ever to have won both the first race he ever raced and the last race he ever raced. Now, the first race he ever raced was actually just a little small 3-lap race around a circuit. But he won that race, and the last race that he drove was a Formula One, and he won that race as well. So, very, very interesting character. Now, unlike many other of the Formula One drivers, he didn't really hang around the Formula One circuit after that, wasn't really involved with Formula One at all, really, for the rest of his life. What he did do was he got into building, or I should say rebuilding, classic cars. He and a friend formed a classic car restoration shop in California, and apparently very, very successful. It sold in about 1985 to a Jordanian gentleman, and Phil continued to work there after he and his partner sold it to the Jordanian gentleman. And then actually he worked there for let me get my years right. Yeah, he worked there for another 10 years. And I think I said earlier he died in 1985. That's not true. He died in 2008, which is of course very much different. But anyway, a little slip up there on the years. But anyway, he had a very full life, and in the end, he succumbed to cancer. And let's face it, these days you got to die of something, right? You can't just die of old age. So if you look at Phil, he was actually 82, 83 years old when he died. So a really not a long life by today's standards, but certainly a very good, very nice life. He didn't marry till later in life. He was single for a lot of his life, but he did end up having 2 children. Of course, you know, they neither one of them have got into the racing world, and you don't really hear much about them. The little research I did on them really didn't give a lot of information about what they were doing. He divorced their mother and married the wife he had when he died, and they'd been married for about 6 or 7 years. So anyway, he was known as the quiet gentleman because he was, I guess, a very quiet guy, very unassuming. And like I said, very few people, in fact, most people believe that what I'm trying to say is, most people believe that Mario Andretti was the only American that ever to win a Formula One championship. And of course, Mario Andretti, yes, he won when he was an American, but he was born in Serbia. So Phil Hill is the only American-born Formula One driver. So anyway, let's thank Give, Send, Go for this portion of the Formula One News Hour. You know, you can't always help what happens to you in life, but you can help who you call for help or get online for help when something goes wrong. And so when something bad happens and you need to raise money for yourself or your friends, or maybe you've got a good business idea, then you need to go to Give, Send, Go. It's GiveSendGo.com. Give, Send, Go are a conservative, religious-based organization. They don't have any interest in censorship or not raising funds for somebody because of a religion or a belief, a political belief or something like that. They believe anybody that deserves and needs funds to be raised should be able to go out there and do it without being hassled or anything else. So please go to GiveSendGo.com. That is GiveSendGo.com. Okay, welcome Formula One news fans, and so for this second segment of this week's podcast, I thought we'd take a look at Formula One over the years. As I mentioned in the opening segment, I've been following Formula One since I was about 10, 12 years old, so some 60 years. And there's been a whole boatload of changes in Formula One, not just from the cars perspective, but from the track perspective, from the money perspective, from all the different things that have happened along the way. And what's interesting to me is that some of the drivers from the early days of Formula One became larger than life. A good example is Sir Jackie Stewart. Sir Jackie Stewart really didn't race that many years, but Jackie Stewart did some things with his life, I think that has really made him a larger than life person as the Formula One has advanced. Formula One, when I was a kid, you could go to the races, you could wander wherever you wanted to on the track, you could wander into the pits, you could go anywhere you wanted. You go walk up to the drivers. Typically, there might be 2,000-3,000 people at the most at a race. It was really a rich gentleman's sport. So you had people that had money that wanted to be involved in car racing, and so they actually went ahead and sponsored. But you never knew the cars were being sponsored because there was never any advertising on them. The only name on a car back in the early 60s was the name of the car builder. So it's really interesting as you watch the tracks over the years and you've watched the characters over the years. Formula One's kind of had this ebb and flow to it. In the early days it was a loosely held organization. It was a guy called Bernie Ecclestone who really took Formula One and made it his own. He purchased and owned the Formula One organization, and really he's responsible for growing it into what it is today. And along the way, we've seen some really incredible drivers, but the cars have changed so much that it's hard to say along the way who is a good driver, a better driver, a great driver, who's the GOAT. Everybody wants to talk about Fangio and Jim Clark being the GOAT, and in a lot of ways you can understand why. It was because back in those days, the cars were heavy to drive. They had clutches that were really heavy to push in. They had manual gearboxes, and the first few years, it was kind of like a car. You had to guess where the gears were. But as time advanced, they went to what they called gate shifting. And the nice thing about gate shifting was it stopped them from accidentally getting into the wrong gear. There was many engines that exploded along the way when somebody was trying to go, say, from fourth to fourth to third to second to first and up and down the gears, and they'd miss it. And they'd, instead of going from sixth to fourth as an example, they'd go from sixth to second, and that the sudden burst under the engine, back in those days where the reliability was really not that good, then they'd blow the engine and they were out of the race. The other things about those cars back then, most of them were V8 engines. They tried with V10s, V12s, and even BRM tried with a V16 engine. And of course the engine worked very well, but no other part in the car worked well because it couldn't stand the torque. Mainly the gearboxes. The gearboxes would get stripped out of the cars. But there were very different beasts to drive then. And the drivers then were very, very different to what they are now. Their talents were very different. The need to be so physically fit. Not to say that today's drivers don't need to be so physically fit, but I think the drivers today need to be physically fit in a different way to what the drivers of today or the drivers of yesterday needed to be physically fit. Many times, Jim Clark, I remember hearing interviews with him saying, he had blisters on his hand, on his right hand, from the gear lever and from his left foot on the clutch pedal. because of the number of times they would be changing gears. You know, today I think the average driver changes gear about 55 to 60 times per lap. Well, that really hasn't changed that much, but the difference is they were doing it with manual gearboxes and a very heavy clutch pedal. And the cars back then didn't have power steering. The cars today have power steering. So they had to be fit in a very, very different way. And so the absolute physical kind of stress that was put on the racing cars driver's body back then was very different. But really, you know, the speeds were not that different. The Formula One cars of the middle 60s, early 60s in fact, were doing 160, 180, 190 miles an hour on the long straights like at Nuremberg. They'd get up to 190 miles an hour. And today, yeah, they're getting up to 200, 220, on the odd occasion 225. So what was the difference? You know, back then, why have we not seen such a big speed difference? Of course, the answer is obvious. If you go on 190 or 200 miles an hour down the straightaway and you've got a right angle turn at the end, you got to be able to brake. So the speeds are being withheld back today, I think, because of the ability of the brakes to stop the car, or not really stop it, but to get it down to a speed that the car can handle the corner. But still, when you think about what the guys back then were doing and what they're doing now, it's kind of really, really interesting. And we've watched as the years have gone by, you know, from the Jim Clarks, the Jackie Stewarts, the Graham Hills, you know, and then we had the Ayrton Sennas, the Alain Prosts, and the Michael Schumachers, the David Coulthards, you know, and then Graham Hill's son, also a Formula One world champion, going through there. And now, you know, we've got the new breed, you know, the Sebastian Vettels, Lewis Hamiltons, and of course the latest one, Max Verstappen. But if you look at the ebb and flow through the years, I think you can really look and see that as the cars changed and the drivers had to change with these changing styles, then you saw some that were extremely good and some that were pretty average, if you can call a Formula One car driver average. But it's been really interesting to watch the ebb and flow of things through the years. Now, the greatest thing that we've watched over the years is safety, right? If you remember in the beginning, I was talking about when we used to go to the track. In fact, you know, the last, strange enough, the last live Formula One race that I went to before I went to this one here in Austin, and I know it's been here in Austin 10 years, but the last one I went to was in Mosport in Canada, which was the Canadian Grand Prix, and that was back in about 1972 or 1973, I think. Was when I was on my way actually to Australia, but ended up here in the United States. So the interesting thing was, even then in the early 70s, you know, I remember walking all over that track, and you know, you could actually walk across the track to get to the other side, and all those kinds of things. And then as you've watched, certainly Jackie Stewart has had a huge influence on how the safety has taken over and become a big part, thankfully, of the racing world, because Formula One racing world, especially because we lost so many really, really great drivers. And some made it through. You know, Jackie X made it through. Phil Hill, we just got through talking about Phil. He made it through. Emerson Fittipaldi. You know, so there were those that over time that made it through. But if you remember, one of the things that I was talking about last week, it wasn't just drivers weren't dying years ago just because of the malfunctioning of the cars. Sometimes the drivers were trying to do things that the cars couldn't do. And because of that, and because there was no safety in the cars, then drivers died. You know, when we look at what happened to Roman Grosjean a couple of years ago, I think it was either Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi, and he went straight through the guardrail, split the guardrail in two, and his car split in two, and it burst into flames. He got out and he walked away. He was just fine. In a lot of ways, the very same thing happened to Francois Sauveur when he was killed back in 1973. He actually went through the guardrails. His car went through, and it had a terrible effect on his body, killed him instantly. But an almost identical accident, let's say 50 years apart, one driver gets up and walks away, and the other driver is dead. So the safety, if you look at how the race car driver sits in their car today versus how they sat in their cars back in the 60s, as the driver position has evolved, they've been able to build, they have tunnels around their legs, all kinds of safety cages inside there. And if you actually look at the way they sit in the car, and in a head-on, if they were to hit something head-on, their body will actually just do this on them. So it's like their body, instead of their legs and everything being straight out and they're nearly lying down like they used to, then their body's in such a position that it can also absorb some of the impact of the car as it crumbles up in front of them, so that they don't break their feet, break their legs and everything. Sure, there's still that possibility exists. In fact, Alex Zanardi is a very good example of that. An old IndyCar driver who went to Formula One and lost both his legs in a Formula One accident. And that poor guy's just accident prone because he's had a number of accidents since, and he got into competitive wheelchair bike racing about 2-3 years ago, had a really bad accident, was in the hospital for about a year and a half. But anyway, back to Formula One racing. So as we've watched, the cars have evolved. They've gone through the period of really naturally aspirated, V10s of whatever V we can build to see if we can make the car faster. And what they found out, of course, over time was that having a bigger engine with more cylinders didn't actually make it the right thing to do. What's really strange, or not strange, but another interesting fact is, the engines back then in Formula One turned their RPMs were anywhere from say 7,000-8,000 RPM. Today, those Formula One engines are turning at 18,000, so 18,400 RPM. Because one of the things that they discovered was that, of course, torque is a lot better when the RPMs are high than when it's low. There are some engines that will defy that rule, but for the most part, that comes out to be true. So the way the engines are constructed now is very, very different. If you look at your NASCAR engines, which are still pretty much your standard, big block V8 things, they're turning maybe at 11,000 RPM. But remember, it's a very different type of racing. The whole thing a NASCAR wants to do is get up to speed and try and stay there the whole time. Whereas Formula One cars are dropping off and speeding up and dropping off and speeding up. So as the cars have evolved, then the drivers evolved with them. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the fitness of the drivers. If you get a chance, watch the Netflix series on Formula One, Drive to Survive. It's very good. Some of the exercises and some of the things you'll see the drivers doing is testing their reaction times. Because now the time between when the driver needs to react to a corner and to take the corner compared to what it was back in the 60s is very different. Remember now, because of the engineering, the car can start braking as it comes into the turn. It will start braking a lot later. I mean, a lot later than what they used to in the 60s. So the driver reactions have to be really, really fast as they come down from, say, 220 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour, sometimes 40 miles an hour to take on some of these turns. But the way that they're doing it is so much later When I say later, when they're actually starting to brake is so much later. So they're relying on the brakes and the downforce of the car to stop them, to get them into the turn. Whereas in the 60s, especially before they came up with ground effects. If you remember, we had a series we talked about Colin Chapman, who is the father of ground effects. And in fact, the guy that works for Red Bull as the main ground effects guy now, the main chassis designer, is a disciple of Colin Chapman. So anyway, went back to why they need to have these quick reflexes, because in the days of past, the drivers were preparing maybe instead of, let's say, 200 yards from the turn, preparing for the turn, they were preparing a quarter of a mile away, which is a much different thing. But they had to, because they had no downforce and they were relying on their gears and on the brakes. Remember, I was talking about when Francois Sauveur died, Jackie Stewart determined that the reason that he died was because he had the car in the wrong gear, which had the engine RPM all wrong for stabilizing the car. Those things still come into play today. The engine RPM and the engine stabilizing the car is still in play today. It's for a much shorter period of time, right? Because they're braking much later, they're getting through the corner and accelerating much faster. Their overall speed is not that much different, but from getting from high speed to low speed and back to high speed is a much smaller time frame. And so this is where the difference in the fitness of the drivers come in. As I was talking to one of the older drivers at the Dakota, and he and I were talking about that could the Jim Clarks, the Juan Fangios, the Graham Hills, the Jackie Stewart, could their bodies have absorbed the G-forces back then that the drivers today absorb? One of the things Mario Andretti took a little Formula One 2013 Formula One car around Dakota track, and 3 laps in, and when he got out, he was talking about how badly one side of his neck hurt when he went around one corner, and the other side of the neck hurt, and that's because of the G-forces. And then of course they've got the helmet on top. Now they do have restraints in there to help them with that, but the sheer force of their bodies going through that means that they have to do an entirely different type of training to what the guys did back in the 60s. Guys back in the 60s, we're talking maybe just about the overall workout type of deal, whereas now they have to do really specific workouts so that their bodies can absorb the continuous G-forces. Remember, this is not for 5 or 10 minutes. This is for an hour, on average, an hour and a half. Now, to you and me, that might not sound like a lot, but just try this. Go to one of the fairgrounds and get on one of those really high roller coasters with really steep drops and ups and lefts and rights, and just get on it for an hour and a half and see how you feel when you get off. Because that's a lot what these drivers go through, but even worse, because of the sheer force that their bodies are being asked to put up with as they make their way around the track. Typically, what have we got? Anywhere from 17 to 23 turns in a track now, and not now, but always have been, and somewhere in the 50-something gear changes. Now it's all paddle shifters. The clutch is a paddle shift, and the up and down gear shifting is paddle shifting. So they've really got the brake pedal and the gas pedal to deal with, which is something that the drivers of old dealt with all the time, is what we call towing and heeling. That was the ability, if you remember, I think I brought it up in one of the earlier podcasts. Towing and heeling is the ability to hit the clutch, the brake, and the gas pedal all at the same time. So what you do is you use your left foot for the clutch, and then you use the palm or the upper palm toe of your right foot for the brake and the lower part for the gas pedal, because you've got to be, as you're coming up and changing gears, you've got to get those engine RPM up so that the gear you're going into, that RPM and that gear match. Otherwise you'll blow up your engine or you'll lock up your rear wheels. You'll hear them still talk about that going on, and you'll see it occasionally in the races where the driver inadvertently locks up the rear wheels, and just going straight down the straightaway, he locks up those rear wheels. It's just like slamming the brakes on the rear wheels if he gets the wrong gear too quickly. So he's got a lot going on in there, and so obviously the drivers today are very, very fit, you know, and because they're all small guys with the exceptions of a couple. But if you ever get the chance and you can get up close and go meet some of these drivers, that most of them are shorter than me. I'm 5'7", and of course they're a lot lighter than me. I'm a little overweight now, but when I was their age, I weighed 130 pounds. So you know, probably if I'd been any good, I could have been one, but I wasn't that good. Everybody wants to be a young kid in England, wants to grow up to be a race car driver, I think. But very, very few achieve that because of the skill sets involved. One of the skill sets that all of these drivers have, okay, all of them, from the Fangios in the 50s and even before those guys to today, the drivers can feel every wheel through that bum, right? They can feel every wheel on the road through that bum the whole time. So that's when if you watch the races, you'll see them as somebody will suddenly make a quick jerk with the steering wheel, and what that means is they've felt a wheel, usually the rear wheels, starting to come loose, and the car's starting to wiggle on them. So they're correcting that oversteer or understeer, whatever the case may be. So the other thing that's changed in Formula One over the years, of course, is the money. Like I say, it started off a gentleman's sport with a few rich gentlemen and maybe not so rich gentlemen forking up money to build a race car and pay drivers. You know, the drivers back then didn't make anywhere near the money that they're making today. The big money really didn't start coming in probably till the late 70s, early 80s. Let me get his name. Mario Andretti said that he was paid by Colin Chapman by the number of points, $10,000 per point that he made in the World Championship. You know, versus Max Verstappen, even Michael Schumacher. Michael Schumacher, you know, 25 years ago was making 30 million a year. So how did this come about? Well, it came about, one, because Bernie Ecclestone did an incredible job of building up Formula One into a really good spectator sport. You know, we've got to keep the fans off the track. We've got to build fences around the track. We've got to build safety. We've got to build all of the things that make it look like it's a really professionally put together racetrack, which it is. Even the street car races, they've got all the protections for the drivers and the spectators. One of the things that happened, I think it was about 1960, I think, or 61, where Phil Hill, I think it was 61, Phil Hill, when he won that World Championship, Jim Clark and another driver, I can't remember the name, got involved in a wreck, and the other driver's car flew off into the stands and killed 15 of the spectators. So then, it's pretty obvious then that we're going to need to start doing something about protecting the spectators as well as the drivers. So over the years, it was Colin Chapman and Lotus that decided to turn his car into a mobile billboard. So it was, if you remember, all the early cars, all of a sudden, the only thing they had on them was the name of the team, Lotus or Brabham or Cooper or whatever, BRM, whatever it was. And then all of a sudden we started seeing Gulf Oil or John Player's cigarettes and all that kind of stuff. So now big advertising money was starting to come into play. And as big advertising money started to come into play, that meant advertising money, right? So the teams now had money to advertise. So Bernie Ecclestone bought bought Formula One at just the right time because Colin Chapman had monetized Formula One. Everybody gives him credit for doing that. He was the one. He went out to Gulf Oil in the very beginning and said, "You need to sponsor us. We'll paint our car to look like your gasoline." And then the cigarette companies got involved, and now you look. It's a lot of technology companies that are involved right now because there's a lot of technology in the cars. So as big money started to come in, then of course the drivers got to be more popular. Then we started needing bodyguards for the drivers. We needed all kinds of things to take care now of these superstars, right? Probably the first superstars, because let's face it, Jackie Stewart was not a superstar when he was driving. He grew into the myth that is Jackie Stewart. Believe me, he's not a myth. When you go around these tracks, he is responsible for a lot of the safety that you see out there. He really started pushing, especially after Francois Server died. But even before that, that was going to be his last year in racing anyway, and he was really starting to push for safety. And so now you see it. We have helicopters on standby, we got ambulances, we have medical rooms, we got the entirety of a small town and a racetrack really to take care of 20 guys. Think about that. It's 20 guys out there driving cars, and you see all of this money being spent on 20 guys. Now you might say, well, why would we do that? Well, there's a lot of technology in your car today that comes from Formula One. I remember my piece on the steering wheel. The paddle shifter came from Ferrari back in the early 90s, maybe. It slowly made its way to passenger cars later on, but that's probably one of the bigger things going. Your steering wheel today, look at all of the technology that's in your steering wheel in your car. Look at the technology that's in the steering wheel in a Formula One car. So and then look at the tires. Look at how tire technology. It's most of the people that are listening to this podcast or watching this podcast have never heard of a thing called a cross-ply tire. The cross-ply tire was the tire of old. The radial tire, which is what nobody buys anything but radial tires today. But it used to be nobody bought anything other than cross-ply tires. And the reason was that radial tires were still so new and they weren't really tested like they are today. And so everybody had a cross-ply tire, but there was another big reason for everybody having a cross-ply tire: cost. Cross-ply tires were about 1/3 of the cost of a radial tire. You could go buy, because this is 40, 50 years ago, you could go buy a cross-ply tire for your car for $10, $15, or you could buy a radial tire for Michelin tire for $30, $35. Well, what do you think the average person was doing? But over time, cross-ply tires were phased out for complete radial tire. I mean, for radial tires. Because the technology got to be where we could bring the cost down, like everything else. As the cost comes down, then the product becomes more saturated across the spectrum. But if you watch what these guys are doing with the tires after they take them off these Formula One cars and what they're looking for, they have a little thing that they take. They get the tire off. They heat up certain sectors of the tire. Underneath those sectors of the tires, there's little holes. And so they take a torch and they heat the tire up to where they can take a scraper and scrape off the top rubber so they can look and see what's happened to those little holes underneath. So there's a lot of technology and research going into the tires. So engines, your car engines, look at the reliability of your car engines today compared to 20, 30 years ago. It used to be that Mercedes would give you a badge if you got 100,000 miles on your car. Today, if you don't get 100,000 miles on your car, everybody's mad and angry. People expect to get 200,000, 300,000 miles out of their cars today, and they do. Now, there's other reasons for that, But a lot of the reasons, a lot of the engineering is coming from Formula One, coming from Indy, coming from NASCAR, coming from the sports car worlds, from the Le Mans 24-hour races. There's a lot of research and a lot of really good stuff going on that we decided to pay these 20 guys all of this money and provide all of this security and all of the protections to make sure that we can get up every day and watch them race on the Formula One circuit. So I think that kind of brings an end to this week's podcast. Let's go ahead and thank Thenology for their sponsorship. Thenology is a data center in Austin, Texas. As you've heard me say many times, there's a lot of data collected by these cars. I actually heard on one of the newscasts or podcasts from the television cast, something like 1 terabyte of data per race is collected. Now that's all text data. So for guys like me that are in the technology world, that's a lot of data. Well, businesses also collect a lot of data, and you want to store that in a data center. If you want a public cloud, a private cloud, co-location, Thenology is your place to go. That's Thenology.com. They're right here in Austin, Texas. That is Thenology.com. So until next week, and maybe hopefully we've got some emails out there, and hopefully we'll get to have bring you an interview. We're trying with 3 or 4 of the more mature race car drivers of yesteryear, and hopefully we'll be lucky. We're also trying to get Hannah Schmitz. I really want to get to do an interview with her. So we've got messages into Red Bull, and we've actually got a little backdoor entry into Red Bull that we're trying as well. Hopefully we'll have an interview, and hopefully we'll get to talk to Hannah Schmitz. So until next week, we want to say thank you to Andre Kuhn for his great production of the Formula One News Hour, and of course all of his technical expertise, because he also goes ahead and gets rid of all of my mistakes and makes it look like I'm just an absolutely perfect podcaster. But so anyway, until next week, this is Jonathan Steele. Have a great week.